All right, welcome to the July Cyber Look Back here with IronNet. My name is Joel Bork, and I will be your host for today. With me, once again, is our threat analysis uh, uh, team member, Joey Fitzpatrick. How are you doing today? And welcome to the show.
Good, man. Good to have you. Good to see
Awesome.
you.
Hey, yeah, it's July, so we're going into the 4th of July weekend, but we wanted to bring you the cyber news regardless. You may notice that Peter Rydzinski is on vacation, so we do miss him dearly, but the show must go on. So let's jump into today's session titled, Do You See What We See? There's two sides of every coin, Microsoft, South Korea, Russia. So we're going to be jumping into those topics and digging into that, looking back into what's happened over the past month. Joey, are you ready?
Ready to go, man. Let's do it.
Perfect. So we're going to start by talking about not security news, and then we're going to jump quickly into the security news. So first of all, welcome. I want to welcome you guys. Thank you for being here. We are here because of you. So please, we want to get your questions answered. So a little bit of housekeeping. Bottom of the screen, you'll see a question mark. Please click on that when you have questions. Ask us questions. We'll try to get your questions answered in real time. If not, we will circle back up with you after and get you an answer to your question. So with that being said, let's jump in. You may have seen it. You may not have, but Microsoft is releasing Windows 11. So this is a little bit of news where we're going to be talking about what is Windows 11. Well, we brought you a very, very technical slide on exactly what it is and how it's going to work. And here it is. Basically, it's Windows 10 mixed with a little bit of Linux. And that is your Microsoft news for the day. Now, on the security side of things, we need to pivot and let's talk about what's happening in Microsoft from a security side. So what happened very recently was that hackers tricked Microsoft into signing a driver, and it was loaded with a rootkit. Now, why is this important? Well, let's talk about this for a second. Because, Joey, do you remember what happened in SolarWinds? How did they get their malicious DLL into the SolarWinds code base?
Right. Yeah. So with SolarWinds, it was actually packaged as a legitimate update.
That's it, right? But what they did was they broke into the software development lifecycle. It was signed by SolarWinds, and then it was deployed as a legitimate update. Well, this example was a rootkit that was signed by Microsoft, and it was delivered as a driver. Now, it was interesting because this incident, Microsoft said, had the rootkit communicating with a command and control server over in China. Now, this driver was called NetFilter, and it said to target gaming environments. So it was really interesting because there wasn't a whole lot of information on, well, what gaming environment was it targeting? But the goal was to spoof their geolocation and cheat the system and play from anywhere, right? And they used this via keyloggers. Now, they also dubbed this malware RetLiftin, which is basically NetFilter backwards. But it was really interesting because this driver, it can intercept your network traffic. It can add new root certificates, set a new proxy server, and even modify your internet settings without a user's consent. Now, Joey, I want to kind of pick your brain real quick. Okay, they were targeting gaming environments, but what if they wanted to do something else? I mean, we're talking intercepting network traffic, new proxies, key logging. What could be done with that level of access?
Interesting. This was discovered by G-Data Cybersecurity, and I'd be very curious as to why this threat actor was kind of targeting, the gaming sector in China. So if you're keylogging, immediately you can get obviously whatever you're typing, but what immediately comes to mind is like banking information. Any credentials you basically are typing into the computer, you're going to get as the threat actor. So be kind of understanding, figure out what the threat actor is actually going after.
When you got to think, if you're keylogging everything on a device, well, if you have a password manager, they're going to get those credentials. Right. And what does that give access to across your organization? We've had discussions on this show about that in the past. So really, really interesting. I was surprised to see that they just said it was targeting gaming environments so they could cheat the system. When if you're putting keyloggers on devices for gamers, how are they going to monetize? What are they actually after? So I'm excited to see more come up around this in the future.
Now, this stuff is... Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Joel.
I was just going to say the oldest sample available on VirusTotal was March 17th of this year. So it is fairly new.
Right. Legitimate software acting maliciously is something that's kind of been scary in the past little bit, right? Past few months, past few years. And so kind of like one of the earliest examples of this would be like Stuxnet, right? Where the code signing certs were actually stolen from Realtek and JMicron. And it's not too different than even, say, SolarWinds, right? Like you said earlier, where, legitimate software is now being used maliciously. So kudos to G Data Security on actually picking up on this and saying, hey, wait a minute. This is, this benign software, supposed to be benign software, is reaching out to C2 servers in China. Let's take a look at that, right? Whereas people would say, oh, it's signed by Microsoft, must be good to go, right?
Well, and most people would, right? And so here's the crazy part is Microsoft took a look back and they're like, okay, where did this driver come from? Well, it came from a third party, basically a third party that Microsoft supply chain to get their drivers developed. So they were compromised. The malicious rootkit was injected into their driver. It was then submitted to Microsoft, who then signed it. So we're talking about a Microsoft supply chain then impacting everyone, right? It's pretty wild.
They follow the process, right? And we teach, right, our cybersecurity analysts, hey, is it signed? Is that one of the first indicators to look at, right? As a tier 1 analyst. And that's usually a good, like, hey, should we trust it or not? So I mean, how do you go ahead now and say, oh, if it's signed, it's good to go? It's not always true, right? We say, well, it depends, right? What is it actually trying to do? And you can relate this to, say, apps on the Apple App Store or the Android App Store, where, yeah, it makes it into the App Store, but the activity of that app is acting strange or perhaps violating the person's privacy violations.
Well, and that comes back is like, Google and Apple take that seriously, like very seriously. So what Microsoft has done is they suspended the account of the person who submitted that driver, right? But is that enough? Are they taking that far enough, or do they need to really review their driver lifecycle policy?
I feel like Microsoft hasn't really gotten into this sector just yet. And it's funny because you mentioned Windows 11. Windows 11 now allows the loading. And so be curious to see how Microsoft, who takes the onus for this, right? Because in Windows 11, you can load apps now that are in the Android App Store from Amazon. And so who will take the responsibility for this? Will it be Amazon, as they are the App Store owners, or will it be Microsoft saying, actually, we take the onus on this? So I think it's a big discussion that's going to happen here with Windows 11, actually.
Yeah, because I mean, the responsibility clearly can't lie on the third party who developed it if they have malicious intent, right? So it has to be one of the two.
Right.
Awesome. Well, let's keep going because we got a lot of news for you today and we want to jump into a lot. So once again, that was the rootkit that was signed into the NetFilter driver. But on the right-hand side, you can see that, hey, there was another Microsoft issue that happened via Microsoft Edge. And this was a bug that let hackers steal your secrets from any site. So let's talk about this for a second, because this was really interesting. Now, Joey, do you use Microsoft Edge at all?
A little bit. Microsoft Edge is kind of cool because you can run it in like the virtualization state where it's supposed to be more secure. But I'm Chrome. I love Chrome, even though it takes all my RAM.
I know. And so I'm a heavy Chrome user as well. But, Microsoft has really been pumping up Microsoft Edge for a long time.
Yes.
They're saying, hey, we're faster, we're more secure. But are they, right? So what happened recently was that, okay, first of all, they've patched the security incident. But what happened was one of the security issues was that there was a security bypass vulnerability that could be exploited and basically inject and execute arbitrary code in context of any website. So what this actually was a UXSS type of attack, and it was exploiting client-side vulnerabilities in the browser or browser extensions to generate XSS conditions. What the heck does that mean? Well, basically, there was a piece in the translation feature that had vulnerable code. It failed to sanitize input, and therefore it allowed attackers to insert malicious JavaScript code anywhere in the web page that would then allow for an XSS condition. So how did they prove this? Well, they went onto YouTube and onto Facebook, and they basically put the malicious code in a comment, right, and submitted it on YouTube. Well, if any user using Edge traversed to that web page, it would then have an XSS-like condition. So really interesting stuff. It has since been patched, but it's kind of one of these things like, once again, this is the translation feature in Microsoft Edge. So thanks to the security researchers who submitted this CVE, it has since been fixed. All right. Joey, let's move away. Actually, we have one more topic around Microsoft. They had a rough month. Do you mind talking to us about Nibelium, the new Nibelium activity that's occurred?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like Microsoft had a rough year, honestly. They can't
Truth.
seem to catch a break here. Yeah, so Microsoft on June 25th announced new Nibelium activity. And so really quick, Nibelium, this is APT 29, Cozy Bear, right? Same folks who went after it with SolarWinds, Russia, right? So what they're able to do is actually install an information stealing Trojan on a Microsoft customer support agent's computer. And so as Microsoft customer support, you can only imagine all the things you're going to get with that kind of data, right? So again, information gathering, right? That's one of the first steps here they're going after. What was interesting was they were doing and actually conducting password spray and brute forcing attacks. And so after they gained they gained information from the customer agent's box and said, hey, these are customers we want to go after. Those are the types of attacks they were actually executing. And so password spraying, right? This is where an actor actually attempts to use a single password or perhaps even a list of passwords across multiple accounts, usually in a low and slow fashion, right? You want to do like one password for, let's say, admin 1 and then admin 2, same password again. And the reason why you do this is to circumvent account lockout, right? After X amount of tries and X amount of time frame, the account should lock out. That is a group policy setting you should be setting. Opposed to brute forcing, right? Where it's a single account and you're attempting with multiple different passwords, right? And usually that gets thwarted through this group policy where you actually have the account lockout. What was interesting was the victims that actually went after, or the folks who went after, not saying they're compromised here, about 57% of them were IT companies, 20% were government. And about 45% of these companies were US-based companies. So that's also an interesting fact there. And so interesting to see, this is like the next step, right? After, obviously SolarWinds, the Nibelium activity is, what's the next step for APT 29? Who are they trying to get after and what are the reasons why? Some of the companies they went after previously, right, was Microsoft, FireEye, Cisco, some different government agencies back in January. What I'm kind of thinking here is they're going to basically continue to penetrate and continue to expand their access and then do long-term implants, right? 6 month long. We're not going to beacon back home for 6 months up to a year, right? And they're preparing for the next stage. And so we're trying to figure out, hey, what's the next stage? So if you're a company, right, and you're figuring out, okay, how can I help thwart these attacks, right? This goes back to the basics, right? Implementing least privilege models. And there's actually a tool out there called Bloodhound, and it's really great at discovering and analyzing your Active Directory environment. I think a lot of small businesses and even medium to large size businesses kind of are faulted at this. After you grow at a certain rate or you get to a certain size, it's Active Directory can become a mess to actually, handle it and make sure it is secure, right? And you get fast and loose with some of the security groups. So a tool, like I said, that recommend to actually get after this would be Bloodhound. You can actually see how close the attack can get to owning your Active Directory and getting domain access. Another thing you can do is multi-factor authentication, right? It is so important, whether it comes to logging into your VPN or logging into your domain in general, to have multi-factor authentication, right? Because even if they do guess the password, they'll still need the token to actually be able to log in. And that's a way you can kind of detect that. So yeah, Nibelium's after it again.
I love that, Joey, because we've been talking about MFA for forever, right? But password spraying, brute forcing, guys, all of this is mitigated
Super basic, right?
By multi-factor authentication, right? But then you also talk about least privilege, right? And okay, one of the main issues, as you mentioned, the domain gets huge, is it's this permissions creep, right? You start with least privilege and you've only assigned them access to what they need, but as they change jobs, as they grow and get promoted, now they have this scope creep and you've never removed certain things, right? So what are the policies around that? What are the procedures to enforce role-based access control, enforce attribute-based access control, et cetera?
Absolutely. Another good way that, I was listening to Black Hills Information Security podcast, and what they're mentioning was creating a Honey admin account, right? And so what you do is you create an admin account. You're not going to actually use it. You're going to log into it once, then let it be. And you set up a rule that says anytime someone tries to actually log into this account, immediately generate an alert, because no one should ever be logging into it, right? Is the Honey admin account. And so I thought that was a really creative way to kind of get after detecting an APT in your environment and perhaps even brute forcing, right?
Well, and so in this example, I don't think these customer support folks were probably admins. I think so. Maybe even do a custom, do an admin honeypot account and maybe a basic user, because they're pivoting to these service accounts in order to gain access. So yeah, no, I love that. And definitely a lot less maintenance than honeypots and honey networks for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It takes like 2 minutes to set up. So
right. So do it, guys. If you can, set an alert for it, create a dashboard that just is big and red. And if you have any logins to that account, it will light up like a firework. Happy 4th of July to everyone as well. Okay. Let's move on. Joey, let's talk about South Korea. I thought this one was really interesting. I actually want to go back, and I'm going to talk about some of the historical stuff that's happened with South Korea and North Korea, right, and the conflicts they've had in cyberspace. But then I'd like you to talk about what's happened in the past few weeks. Deal?
Awesome.
Okay. So it was interesting. Back in 2014, and that's as far back as I'm going to go on this, but there's a threat actor group called Kim Suki. They are a notorious cyber actor group out of North Korea. And back in 2014, they made a cyber attack against South Korea's hydroelectric and nuclear power facilities. That was really one of the first times when it was a big deal. Now, I have a quick graphic for you from back then, is because it was really interesting is, hey, after this hack, guess what? They were holding cyber attack drills after this hack, right? So the firm said, hey, we're going to start doing purple teaming, maybe red teaming. We're doing drills, right? And you can see the date there this was back in December of 2014. So they began preparing for instances like what happened recently. Now, what we also saw was North Korea also hacked into the defense ministry in 2016, potentially a different group, but still from North Korea. And then the Kimsuki group is also thought to be behind a series of phishing attacks in 2019 against the South Korean police and Ministry of Unification. That brings us all the way to 2021, where South Korea's nuclear research agency was hacked using a VPN flaw. Joey, can you walk us through this a little bit?
Yeah. So actually, what's funny is, NSA and GCHQ, I believe, both posted an alert back in, say January that said, hey, threat actors, they are absolutely going after your VPN. And here's the different, like the Pulse Secure VPN exploit. They're actively exploiting this, right? And this goes, and I think it's because, this year, obviously with COVID, more companies turning to VPN. Maybe they didn't use VPN as heavily before, but you guys got to be logging the VPN sessions and got to be using multi-factor authentication, right? Okay, so yeah, Kim Suki went after the VPN vulnerability after Korea Atomic Agency. This makes sense, right? North Korea obviously is against South Korea, and also they're after any intel on nuclear developments. This makes a lot of sense here. North Korea. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to kind of level set. So it was interesting because Joey and I didn't know. We're like, does South Korea have nuclear weapons? And the reality is, no, they don't. They do nuclear power, and they're one of the largest nuclear power countries in the world. North Korea, on the other hand, does have nuclear weapons, but it sounds like they don't have the nuclear energy side down yet. Sorry, Joey, back to you.
Right. So obviously, that's some research they want to get into. They're also breaking into COVID-19 pharmaceutical companies this year. And obviously, North Korea is struggling with COVID-19 and different food shortages. So there's that. They also were able to access the Foreign Affairs and Security Advisor's email. So, I mean, they're all up in South Korea's business, right? This report actually came out of Weibo Intelligence Agency. This is a security research arm of Weibo, which is a Chinese company. Weibo Intelligence also reports that they recently are monitoring the Lazarus APT out of North Korea, and they're also carrying out similar attacks against military targets in South Korea. So again, all military intelligence type gain. So what actually happened in this specific attack back in this month, or excuse me, now in June, was that they were referencing Korea-US summit documents, right? That's what they were saying, like, hey, there's like phishing attempts, right? These documents are actually delivered in HWP format. And if you're familiar with this is a word processor document format that is, obviously popular in South Korea because it supports the Korean alphabet. So popular in South Korea, popular in government documents. And this remote access Trojan is an improvement off of the remote access Trojan they deployed actually last year. And so it improves spy functions like key logging, screen monitoring, file monitoring, all those sorts of capabilities. And so this is par for the course, for North Korea. One of the things it did do was it actually used more living off the land binaries. So little bins like MSHTA executable, right? they're able to actually execute malicious HTA files. So actually, it's a benign process, reaches out to a malicious website, grabs that script, actually able to execute it. Once it does execute, it copies malicious files to a temp directory and actually executes this malicious file as well. This does some privilege escalation, and then once it does privilege escalation, if it's not already an admin, it's able to do things like remote shell, file upload, execution. They're stealing a lot of documents like Word documents, PowerPoints, and then obviously other spy functions like keyboard logging, USB monitoring, so forth and so on. So obviously a great intelligence operation there.
Yeah, and so I think it's interesting because we've talked about Russia and about China and about how they're kleptocracies. North Korea is definitely another kleptocracy, right? So, well, I also haven't heard of North Korea in the news recently until this. We haven't seen them testing many missiles lately, and I think part of that is because of the food shortages and the other issues they're experiencing as a nation. But also, on the other hand, like they are still doing the core cryptocurrency theft. Those activities never stopped. And so
Right.
I think it's really interesting to see that, hey, now they're kind of moving back to these high value targets like energy research, pharmaceutical companies, right? Things that directly impact their society. And I would expect this to continue. What do you think, Joey?
Absolutely. What I point to is, I think it's important to remember that the cyber domain as a whole is a really cheap way to gain intellectual property and intelligence, right? You don't need to put boots on the ground. You don't need to actually, hire someone at the company to steal documents, right? You see a handful of smart folks inside a room with internet access, gaining access to countries you want to go after, their networks, right? Why not do that, right? And so you look at countries like North Korea or even Russia that are strapped for cash. This is a really easy and cheap way to have those advantages.
Yeah, spot on. Now let's move on. We're already sitting at 11:22. I know we've talked about kind of shrinking the time frame we do these in. We were sitting at about 40 to 50 minutes in the last ones. We're trying to bring them down to about 30, 35 minutes. So let's jump into our last topic. And this was what happened recently, and this was in June. But Biden and Putin met. And one of the main conversations was around cybersecurity. Let's talk about what happened during and post the Geneva meeting between these. Joey, do you want to kick this off?
Yeah, absolutely. So they had a bunch of different big talks. And this comes off the heels of the Colonial Pipeline attacks, SolarWinds, a litany really of cyber attacks against the United States and other countries, right? And so what Biden is trying to rope in here is have Russia take some sort of responsibility for future attacks, right? Getting Russia to admit or knowingly admit they assisted in these attacks is probably not going to happen, right? But moving forward, what can we do foreign policy wise to kind of help rope this in, right? And some of the topics that went over, so briefly, like cyber consultations, right? There's 16 different exemptions that President Biden mentioned, cyber criminal swaps, and U.S. offensive capabilities. So we're going to dive into the first one here. Cyber consultations, right? So experts from both countries will be tasked to work on specific understandings of what's off limit for each country, right? And to follow up on attacks originating in their country. And so, I know obviously President Biden, he mentioned a list of different 16 sectors that are off limits, such as, energy and water, IT, healthcare, and agriculture, right? But Joel, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. I mean, what does that really mean, right? I mean, yeah, okay, they're off limits, but is President Putin now going to be like, oh, sorry, didn't know healthcare is off limits?
Right. Oh, hey, I didn't know energy and oil and gas was off limits. And here's the thing is like, okay, dark side, we walked through this in one of our previous episodes. They weren't state sponsored. They were just state encouraged or not encouraged or given free reign to do whatever they want, right? So when we talk about the group dark side hacking into critical infrastructure, let's just say they do that again. I don't think they will because I don't think they wanted to attract the attention of the FBI and the NSA the way they did. So they really much want to coast under this radar. But let's just, for example, say they hit healthcare, right? They do a SolarWinds type attack where they infect a number of organizations and they end up taking one of these healthcare organizations. It's on Biden's list. It obviously came from Russia. Is he going to respond? Besides just stealing back the crypto that they've already tried to ransom? Like, I think at this point, the answer needs to be absolutely.
Right.
I mean, you've given him a list and said these are off limits, and now it's coming from Russia. What would you expect to see from the U.S.?
Yeah, absolutely. You're drawing a red line, right? Drawing a line in the sand here. And now I think if you're going to say that and say, hey, these things are off limits, and then we do find in the next few months or up to a year, right, that some entity in Russia was attacking this, and Russia does nothing about it, I think it's fair game to differ tat, right? Go back at it. What's interesting about the energy attacks, so even the healthcare ones, right, is look at like, Stuxnet, look at Colonial Pipeline, all these attacks lead up to devastating impacts, obviously, in the economy and on your infrastructure per se, but none have really led to mass scale, death. And I think these countries are very aware of that, and I think they always tiptoe up to the point and then walk it back, right? And so I'm saying is like, obviously Stuxnet, it didn't blow up any nuclear weapons, right? Or nuclear reactors, in the sense that like, it caused an explosion and people died. Same thing with Colonial Pipeline. No one died of that, right? Mm-hmm. Just economical impacts. But what happens when a country, say not Russia, plays fast and loose in the cyber realm, and they actually do exploit all the way up to it, and they actually do cost lives? I mean, this is a scenario where, you can definitely expect a response.
Well, and so let's talk about this in this specific example, right? Joe Biden and Putin agreed that potentially extradition was what should happen for those actors. So let's take it from the U.S. perspective. Let's say there's somebody in the U.S. who's hacking Russia. They take it up to and past that line. Do we extradite that person to Russia?
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's the next point here, actually, is criminal swaps, right? President Putin suggested swapping between the hackers with the United States, right? President Biden says he's open to the idea. I find it a little bit far-fetched that the United States would extradite to Russia. Also, interesting, would Russia be willing to extradite to the United States?
They haven't in the past.
Right. And so, I don't know, if I'm Putin, I'm like, extradite that U.S. hacking me, right? And then I'm going to hire him on my team, because they're not going to want to spend, 10, 15 years in the gulag, right? So, come over here and come hack back in the United States, and we'll spare your life.
Well, and that's crazy. And so, okay, if we've talked about extradition, do we start with Snowden?
Yeah.
Right? Like,
right.
Like, man, they've been protecting these people who the U.S. has wanted for decades. Where do you begin? And is he only going to pass us like some low-hanging fruit who upset him?
Yeah, that's I wonder too, right? Exactly. Like, are we really going to get the real guys behind? Like, probably not, right? It's one of the most valuable assets today is cyber attacks, and obviously those hackers are valuable assets. So why would you give them up?
Right, and you got to remember, Russia's GDP is the amount of Texas, right? So if these hackers can bring in millions of dollars, that's a large, not a small percentage, but an impactful percentage of the Russian GDP that's helping stimulate the economy. So absolutely. They're not going to give away good hackers, but if they cross Putin and he's like, well, I could make him disappear, or I could show a sign of good faith to the U.S., I think he might do that, because chances are we might pick their brains, but I don't think we'd hire them and put them in any top secret facility to hack back, right?
Most likely not. Yes. The last point on this note here is that it's interesting. Putin claimed that they had provided exhaustive answers on the U.S.'s request for information on 10 different cyber incidents, but the U.S. had yet to respond to Russia on any of the 45 inquiries it posted to, I guess, probably the State Department. So it'd be interesting what inquiries those were that Russia is asking about, and how true that is. And obviously there's two sides of every coin, right? So,
and that's what we're talking about today, right? Because you got to think, okay, if Russia's actually responded, well, they probably said, hey, it wasn't us, right? In every single response. Right. But if there's 40, I mean, you'd be naive if you didn't think we were making sure we knew exactly what Russia knew, right? So
absolutely.
If they've inquired 45 times, we haven't responded
it's funny.
once.
Right. Espionage is a thing, and I think it's appropriate to understand that, and reasonable, right, that every country is in other countries, actually physically country with spies, but also espionage through cyber. I mean, you have to expect that, right? It's gonna be a thing. You're just keeping tabs in the world, right? And the final point they went over here was the U.S. offensive capabilities, right? So President Biden gently reminded President Putin that we have great offensive capabilities, right? And it'd be a shame if we had to use them because Russia didn't step in and stop a future attack. So not a threat, as President Biden said, but it kind of feels like a threat, right? It's like, hey, if you're gonna mess around in our energy sectors and our IT sector is still intellectual property or messed around with our grid, you're going to hear back from us, right? And I think that is, my personal opinion would be like that's appropriate, response, right? I mean, we need to get tough on Russia and say, hey, okay, if you're going to do this, we're going to get back at you.
Well, so let's talk about being tough on Russia. So a couple days ago, there was an incident over by Crimea in the Black Sea. So you may have remembered years ago, there was an invasion. Russia invaded Crimea, and they said it was third-party contractors, right? But they rolled in with Russian tanks.
Little green man.
Yeah, okay, it was Russia. We didn't
Right.
take action on them. They've since annexed Russia, and I'm sure if you look at Russian maps and the world maps we have, that is now part of Russia on the Russian maps. We don't say it. We say it's part of Ukraine still, even though Ukraine has zero sovereignty over it. But what happened this week was there's a British ship over in the Black Sea off the coast of what used to be Ukraine, but I'm sure on Russia maps is now Russia, and it was being surveilled by U.S. airships. Putin is saying that, hey, we are testing Moscow. So because of these incidents, does that mean he'll renege on everything they just shook hands on in the summit? What do you think?
I don't know. I feel like Russia's going to do what Russia wants to do, right? That's just the bottom line, and until someone actually pushes back, they're going to continue to encroach in Eastern Europe. That's my opinion.
Well, and here's the thing is they shot warning shots, and the Russian deputy minister said that the country would bomb the British vessels if they enter the disputed waters again. And those used to be Ukrainian waters. So is this another example of saying, hey, cyber is completely separate from physical? When do those merge? And that's the big question that we'll have to discuss in further episodes.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, with that, guys, please, we did have some questions. We'll circle back around. Please reach out to Joey Fitzpatrick or myself, Joel Bork, on LinkedIn. This was the wrap up of what we saw throughout June in our July Cyber Look Back. Thank you so much for joining us, and please join us on the first Thursday of every month for next month's Cyber Look Back. With that, we'll be signing off. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day, and happy 4th of July to everyone. Joey, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, man.